Greetings, friends. My name is Wa-Kyendo. I'm a policy analyst. From geopolitics to economics, I'm interested in furthering deep and meaningful conversations on public welfare. I've got questions. Now, today's question is lifted from our interest in investigating relations between Kenya, the East African region, and the Indo-Pacific region. It has been said that the 21st century belongs to the Indo-Pacific. This is owed to the region's explosive economic growth and the reputation of China as the world's factory, a reputation that is well earned. The Indo-Pacific is important, therefore, both for global political and economic relations, and also for interactions between the East African region and that part of the world. Today's questions center on China's relations with Djibouti and Somalia. Now, the chart before us shows that in 2016, China's exports to the world, first of all, were valued at $2.27 trillion, making that nation the largest exporter in the world. Of every dollar in goods and services produced, China exported 0.21 cents, right? That's for every dollar of goods and services that they produce. Their exports were now 3.9% of Chinese exports to Africa, of Chinese, sorry, 3.9% of Chinese exports to the world made their way to Africa. And these exports were valued at $89.6 billion. In 2016, China exported $15.93 billion worth of goods to the East African region. Chinese exports to East Africa constituted 18% of the total exports that nation made to the continent of Africa, and 0.70% of China's total exports to the world. Taking a 35% share of that total, Kenya was the region's major destination for Chinese exports. Burundi accounted for 0.28% of China's exports to East Africa, the region's smallest share. Now, relative to its share of the East African region's GDP, population, and total imports, Djibouti imported 7.9 times more Chinese goods than the average East African nation. In that same year, Djibouti imported 30.9 times more than Kenya, the largest dollar value importer of Chinese goods in the region. Somalia itself outperformed 5 nations in the East African +4 region, including most notably Ethiopia. Now, this region here we've called the East Africa +4 because we have taken the East African community and then also included nations that at the time that this data was collected were not members of the East African community. These nations are South Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Somalia. So again, Somalia outperformed 5 nations in the East Africa +4 region, including most notably Ethiopia. That is to say that when imports are scaled to a relative size and set against the regional GDP, population, and net imports, Somalia imports 1.19 times more Chinese goods to East Africa than does Ethiopia. Somalia outperformed South Sudan by a factor of 5.47. Somalia imported 391.94 million in Chinese goods to South Sudan's 46.25 million. What about exports of East African goods to China? Well, Djibouti was the smallest exporter to China, both in the absolute and the relative sense. In 2016, South Sudan exported $2.33 billion worth of exports, or 2,590 times more than did Djibouti. Somalia performed better than Djibouti. In terms of exports to China, China's footprint in South Sudan was 1,465 times greater than it was in Djibouti. Relative to GDP, regional GDP, population, and total regional exports, Somalia's share of exports to China was 8.01 times greater in magnitude than it was than that of Djibouti. Now, I want to pull up a chart showing foreign direct investment flows. Now, the chart before us depicts the foreign direct investment flows from China to Somalia and Djibouti between the years 2003 and 2005. Now, in 2015, the earliest year to which the aggregate data from Johns Hopkins was available at the time, Chinese foreign direct investment to East Africa totaled $4.32 billion American. Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania took 78% of that share. Ethiopia took 26% of that 4.32 billion, while Kenya and Tanzania themselves respectively took 26% and 25% of that total Chinese foreign direct investment to East Africa. Put to scale, however, relative to other East Africa Community Plus 4 nations, foreign direct investment flows to Djibouti were largest relative to the GDP, population, and trade. Right? You compare them and put the flows to scale, and Djibouti actually attracted more foreign direct investment flows than these other countries. Right? In 2015, foreign direct investment flows to Djibouti amounted to $60.46 million. In that same year, Somalia received no foreign direct investment from China. Now, by the year 2019, Djibouti had initiated a $12.4 billion ports and rails infrastructure development project, mostly funded by the Export-Import Bank of China. 14 mega projects valued at about $10 billion are underway. The nation's GDP in 2017 was 1.85 billion. By 2017, Djibouti's debt to GDP ratio was 85%. Much of this debt was owed to China. The exact share, at least at that time, was unknown, and at the moment of this recording is unknown to me. What about the flow of Chinese workers? In 2016, the East African region was host to 30,855 Chinese workers. 59% of these workers were stationed in Ethiopia and Kenya, the region's largest economies. When scaled against GDP and population, Uganda had the highest concentration of Chinese workers in the region. In that year, the concentration of workers in Uganda against that nation's share of GDP and population was 348.7 times higher than the regional average, 12 times greater than Kenya, the next in rank, and 264.2 times greater than Djibouti, and finally 2,225 times greater than Somalia, the nation with the lowest concentration. Relative to GDP, however, Djibouti had the highest concentration of workers in that region. Djibouti maintained its rank when its share of Chinese workers was compared to its share of regional population and regional trade with China and the rest of the world. In 2015, Djibouti was host to 1,470 workers, or 5% of the total number of Chinese workers in East Africa. So, what preferences and trends do we detect? Well, when we talk about imports from China, all factors relative, Chinese imports to the East Africa Community Plus 4 region have the highest cachet in Djibouti. That is to say, that although Kenya imported the largest volume of Chinese goods in the region, Djibouti's appetite for Chinese goods is 7 times greater than average and 273 times greater than South Sudan. With Kenya 3 magnitudes shy of the middle, all East African nations fall below the regional average. China's footprint in exports to East Africa is largest in Djibouti. Notably, both Somalia and Djibouti are after a very similar mixture of Chinese goods. Textiles and machinery make up the largest shares of imports in both countries. What about exports to China? Well, China has little demand for what Djibouti and Somalia have to offer in goods. Notably, China demands more in goods from Somalia than it does Djibouti. In fact, Somalia's exports to China are bigger in relative terms than those of Djibouti. What about foreign direct investment? Well, in the year 2015, Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia received the largest injections of Chinese foreign direct investment in terms of value. Those nations were also the region's most productive. In that year, Ethiopia's economy was the largest. When shares of foreign direct investment is set against GDP and population size, however, China's foreign direct investment footprint is largest in Djibouti. Foreign direct investment flows have risen 150-fold since 2004 to their 2015 level of $60.46 million. By 2019, Djibouti was spending upwards of $11 billion of Chinese money on ports and railway lines. Now, this is public borrowing, right? Different from foreign direct investment, which is direct, private sector investment from China to Djibouti. Now, the nation's GDP in 2017 was 1.85 billion, and the IMF estimated that by 2019, Djibouti's debt to GDP ratio would be 104%, quite unhealthy. By early 2018, Djiboutian authorities had terminated a 30-year contract signed with the United Arab Emirates with UAE DP World of Dubai, a company from the United Arab Emirates, to build and develop all Djiboutian ports and free trade zone facilities. DP World ranks among the largest global port operators. The termination was followed with the development of a new container terminal with Hong Kong-based China Merchants Holding International. Although the London-based Court of International Arbitration ruled the move illegal, Chinese state-backed companies and Djiboutian authorities continue to conduct business, flouting standard international business practice. China Merchants developed and now manages a $3.5 billion free trade zone. A 2019 court order to pay DP World $385 million in compensation has yet to be obeyed. What about Chinese workers? What are the trends saying? Well, Chinese workers are most prevalent in number in Ethiopia and Kenya. Those nations happen to have the largest economies in the region. In 2016, Kenya's and Ethiopia's respective shares of East African productive output were 31% and 30%, respectively. Now, what are the implications of China's presence? China's presence in East Africa is of considerable significance. Trade between China and the region barely registered on the Chinese side of the accounting equation, however. Imports from China and exports to China are both negligible, right? When you look at the accounts from China's side, it just doesn't budge the needle. China's interest in, say, South Sudan is immediately apparent. In 2016, petroleum made South Sudan the region's top dollar value exporter to China. This did not translate into high foreign direct investment injections, however. In that year, FDI flows to Djibouti were double those to South Sudan. Somalia, however, received nothing in the way of foreign direct investment. In the months between late 2018 and early 2019, China was awarded fishing licenses for up to 31 fishing vessels to fish 44 kilometers off the Somali coast. The most significant Sino-Somalian economic development in recent years. This agreement seems to indicate further hesitance on the Chinese part to inject capital in politically unstable countries. Right? So, in recent years, the most important thing to happen between China and Somalia was the awarding these fishing licenses. But China or Chinese foreign direct investment has not been forthcoming, or rather has not flowed into Somalia. Somalia and South Sudan are relatively unstable. Somalia plays host to pirates and extremist Islamic terrorists and foreign troops who are working to try and stabilize the conditions there. I mean, all these are signs of the relative instability. South's relative, right, when compared to other countries in the region and by global standards. South Sudan itself has endured prolonged armed civil conflict. 30 workers were working in Somalia by 2018. 420 workers were registered to be working in South Sudan. Djibouti, on the other hand, had 1,470 Chinese workers. Stability seems to be a factor in Chinese investment considerations. Now, there is much that Chinese imports offer East African countries. Boasting little in the way of industrial capacity, the region must import producer and consumer durables, that is, machines, equipment, etc., in order to meet its demand. Djibouti and Somalia's China import demands are similar in their goods makeup. If their economies maintain an upwards trajectory, both countries' demand for Chinese goods may also continue to rise. China's interest in Djibouti seems peculiar. The nation's economy is the smallest in the region, smaller still than Burundi's. Burundi's population of 10 million was 10 times greater than that of Djibouti. At the global level, however, Djibouti's importance is more apparent. Djibouti's strategic position at the Gulf of Aden before the Suez Canal serves as the important consideration in China's geopolitical calculations with regards to that country. The Gulf sees 1/3 of the world's shipping. 30% of oil in transit to Europe moves through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. 20,000 ships transit through the Gulf of Aden. Asia's export goods to Europe also pass through this Gulf and the Suez Canal. The alternative route, a round trip through South Africa, adds 3 weeks and additional costs to goods being shipped. As the world's top exporter, China certainly has a commercial interest in a secure and safe Gulf of Aden. Now, by the year 2011, 1,900 troops tallied China's contribution to the United Nations Africa peacekeeping efforts. By 2018, 10 years of China People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLAN operations had seen 26,000 officers and soldiers escort 6,595 ships and rescue or aid and come to the rescue or aid of more than 60 Chinese and foreign vessels. In 2015, PLAN personnel and ships helped evacuate Chinese and foreign nationals from Yemen. It is on these metrics that Chinese naval representatives base their rationale for a Djibouti military base, well, at least ostensibly, right? Conceivably, the base will facilitate China's contributions to international anti-piracy operations, multilateral peacekeeping missions in the Gulf and within the African continent itself, and provide refueling and resupply for PLAN operations elsewhere. In 2011, Chinese military personnel and ships also helped evacuate an excess of 35,000 Chinese nationals from Libya, a nation quite a distance from China. Gabe Collins and Andrew S. Erickson purport that, among other factors, the success of this mission was based on a combination of access to African airfields for the Chinese Air Force and for deployment of a PLAN frigate. The Djibouti base will certainly reduce, to a degree, the logistical hurdles of similar missions on Africa's coastline and within the African continent. Furthermore, such efforts stoke the national pride of PRC citizens. Growing economic clout, a low tolerance towards the prospect of Chinese nationals being harassed by political upheavals abroad, Chinese domestic pressures to intervene when Chinese nationals are in trouble, and a desire to act swiftly and efficiently are perhaps some major drivers of Chinese military interests in Djibouti. If maintained, the current trajectory of trade between East Africa, Africa, and China will only drive China further into Djibouti's arms, or Djibouti further into China's arms, depending on how you want to look at it, both political, militarily, if not also economically. Great power militaries have made of Djibouti a preferred outpost. China's own military base was opened on August 1st, 2017. China's foray into Djibouti is not atypical of a great economy. On the dimension of the benign, it certainly has interests little different from those of other powers that it wants to pursue. The potential for concerns over improper Chinese takeover of major national infrastructure facilities may be quoted as a potential hazard. In 2019, on March 29th, March 2019, Djiboutian president helped open Africa's first Luban workshop, a Chinese vocational training institute named after a Chinese architect of great repute. That is not quite the soft power masses. That it is not quite the soft power master stroke is in rhyme with China's designs for Djibouti. Hard power gains without soft power padding. the less than million hearts and minds of Djibouti need not be won. That is at least one conclusion that one may come to.